Events, delivering a What's the Big Idea presentation. Please welcome Kerri Ransfield.
It's November 2015. I had just returned back to Perth after living and working in the Pilbara for 3 years. And during my time there, I had acquired a really expensive habit. And that habit is called photography. Now, I'm definitely not a professional by any means, and I certainly don't claim to have done the scenery that I saw in these pictures any justice. But having come home and deciding what my next move was going to be, I thought, I'm going to go to New Zealand. Some of you are aware New Zealand is my heritage, it's where I'm from. But I'd only returned in childhood for family reasons. I had never actually seen the country as a tourist, through the eyes of a tourist. Of all those beautiful things that you see on the brochures advertising the country, I had never been there. So I thought, while I'd been laid off and the job market was really a bit dour, I thought that I would go home and explore. I was fortunate enough to be able to go and see both islands, the north and the south, and to photograph some of the most spectacular scenery that ever exists on Earth. And again, I don't claim to have done any justice to it. I stayed there for 7 months, and then when I returned back to Perth in May 2016, I got my camera out and I thought, I will do the processing of the images that I took. I hadn't actually looked at any of them since while I was away. To process an image, it's the equivalent of the old darkroom, the darkroom process for film photographers, but here I'm doing it in digital. And as I imported it into Lightroom, and I looked through each of the images, and I got a sense about what my workload for the 1,000 or so images that I'd taken, whether or not I'd be adjusting horizons, brightening exposures, decreasing some shadows. As I went through and I looked at every single image, I started to relive the process that got me there. All of the choreography of moves, the timing, the patience, all of the steps that it took me just before I hit the shutter. Because photography, it is a dance. We somewhat take it for granted with our phones that we can just sort of whip them out and snap, and then if that one doesn't work, we can take it again. Digital photography, you are limited by your SD card, and in film, you are limited by the film. For those who remember the old film cameras, you didn't have the time or the money to really be able to waste any exposure because you had to pay for the whole thing when you went to go and get it developed. So with digital, we can be quite wasteful at taking shots. But to get a great shot, there are some elements that have to be in place to make it perfect. And as I was going through, I recognised that the process that led me up to these photographs, and as I processed them, there's a lot of crossover between those steps that I needed to take, and I think what goes into constructing a meaningful life. Now, there are a lot of elements that go into making a photograph, and I'm not going to go through them all here, but I'm going to give you an overview of the steps that I took to take the photos that you're about to see, and the lessons that I learned from them, and that now, 10 years later since that trip, that I take with me every single day. What lens are you viewing a situation through? This is Wellington. I'm standing on a mountain on a little road overlooking the harbour. Now, being a landscape photographer, the wide-angle lens is my weapon of choice. And what I love about a wide-angle lens is that it leads itself to awe and it leads itself to majesty. And the best thing about landscape photography for me is that there is not one single element of this photo that stands out. Rather, they all work together in concert to give you a full, awe-inspiring, I hope, whole. That is what happens when you view life with a wide-angle lens. It gives you a wide vantage point, and it means that any trouble you have, any problem you have, any one particular thing doesn't stop you or weigh you down. You take it as a whole. And I remember just before I hit this shutter on this photo, my plane flight from Wellington to Auckland had been delayed. I'd left a $2,000 lens on the ferry between the North and South Island, and the car that I had bought to tour around the North and South Island I had about 36 hours left on the ground in Wellington. I still hadn't sold it. So I knew that I was very stressed, but I had to remember at that point, when I got this image at home, I had to think to myself that on a span of 85 years life, if we're lucky, and I was about 27 at the time this was taken, that eventually there's going to be a time in my life, if I zoom out wide enough to see the length, that a missing lens, an unsold car, and a missing flight, they would be very, very happy problems to have. And that way I learned not to take any small problem as an issue. I learned to see it as part of a great and beautiful whole. This is Kurungahaki Gorge. It is the centre of New Zealand's North Island gold rush. And it is where I learnt that composition leads attention. I know that because of the way I've styled this, you're looking at the title card, but really take that away and what your eye is drawn towards is the road leading away. I'm standing on an overpass that leads to the mining shafts either side of me. There is an art and a science to composition in photography. It's called the rule of thirds, and the most important thing I'll tell you that if you are ever taking photographs of landscapes, never put your horizon line dead in the middle. And now that I've told you that, for the next 3, you're going to be looking to see if I've done that, and I haven't. Our eyes are drawn to patterns. If you can overlay an invisible 3x3 grid, breaking this photo up into 9, you'll notice that the points of interest all fall on the intersection of those lines. Our brain loves patterns. And to compose a shot, you have to have all of those elements situated along the intersecting lines. And I think the same way when it comes to life. Now, there are no guarantees in life, but there are things that you can do that makes your brain warm and fuzzy. There are things that we can do that we can see from studies and literature, such as the Harvard Longevity Study, that certain decisions we make can increase your likelihood for happiness at the end of life. And primarily, those things are good relationships, meaningful work, and some measure of financial stability, although not as much as what people think it is. When you sit and take the time to compose and to be intentional about the way, the elements that make up your life, you can create something that is really pleasing and special to both look at, hopefully, and live. One of the most important elements in photography is timing. And so in life. A split second is the difference between winning a gold medal and losing it. A couple of seconds is the difference between catching the bus and missing it. Hours are the difference between patience and impatience, perhaps missing a plane. Timing is everything. And along with timing comes patience. This photo, this is Anzac Bay on the North Island. It is absolutely stinking hot today. The midges are eating at me. I'm at an empty tank of fuel and I'm on top of a mountain. I am waiting for the sun to come down. Waiting, waiting, waiting. And just as the sun lowers behind the tree up on the screen, I focus and I wait and I wait, right until the light is perfect and I hit the shutter. And I knew, even before I got the images back home to Perth, I knew this photo was perfect. The only thing it's had done to it is a slight saturation increase. I've done nothing else to this photo because I waited. I was patient, and I'm a very impatient person. I waited. If you're wondering, it actually came up on Simon's presentation, when you have sun backlighting something, in photography it's called contre-jour, and you have to be very intentional to get contre-jour, because if you get the sun too bright, the whole photo just washes out and it goes white. But if you wait too long and the sun hides behind the trees, the shadows become too bright and the whole photo just goes black. So timing is an exercise in patience, in waiting for your moment, in knowing and being able to anticipate, but also being able to sit in the uncertainty that it may not work out. Indeed, most of my photos do not work out, but this one, I put in the patience and the intention, and I was rewarded. Increased exposure can yield beautiful results. So we're down to the South Island of New Zealand now. This is in Hampton in the Canterbury region. These are called, if you're not aware, these are called the Moiraki boulders. Now in Marimith, my heritage, the boulders were supposedly baskets where people caught fish. They are actually calcites from the Mesopaleocene era. They are calcite deposits that have aggregated or concretized into spherical boulders. Now, believe it or not, this is actually what we call a 5-second exposure. When you hit snap on your camera, usually if you're doing it a day, it will go chick, and like that. But this one, timing again, I had to wait. If you've ever seen the photos with the really silky smooth water, this is how you get the effect. You get the effect by opening the shutter and waiting for it for a couple of seconds, and as the water moves, that's what gives it the silky smooth result. So this was a 5-second exposure. Open, click, waiting. Hoping that a bird isn't going to land on the boulders while and having no idea what it's going to look like when the shutter closes again. Sometimes you need to increase your exposure to get the results that you want. Now, I think perhaps Elvina might be aware of this because she does our accounts, but the biggest exposure that I've had in the last 12 months, I joined Rostrum 11 months ago. My 1-year anniversary is next month. And for me, that was a huge exposure. I'm not a very extroverted person. I'm not very confident speaking in front of people. And I do this precisely to conquer that fear, to be able to do it. And I used to joke that in my first 3 months or so, the most terrifying thing I had to do every week was walk from the top of the car park at Florian Library, down the stairs into the room, because there were so many times I wanted to walk out that door and get back in the car and leave again. So frightened that I was. But if I hadn't been willing to risk that exposure, to risk failure, and I don't know about you, I'm really scared of failure. I'm really afraid of it. To risk looking silly, to risk saying the wrong thing. I did that exposure, and now I'm here in front of you, speaking today, hoping to impart some life lessons to you from the world of photography. I'm going to sum up by leaving you with a quote from the great Ansel Adams. Ansel Adams is the godfather of modern photography, and he said, "You don't just take a photo with a camera. You don't just take a photograph, just with a camera. You bring to the act of photography all the pictures you have seen, the books you have read, the music you have heard, and the people you have loved." And the wonderful thing about this quote is that when you break it down, every single moment in our lives is a snapshot, whether we photograph it or not. And in every single moment, you also bring the acts of love, the things that you have heard, the things you have read, the things you have seen. So knowing that every moment is one that can be counted on to have all of these elements in play, I would implore you to think about what decisions are you going to do differently? Because you don't just take a photograph, you make a photograph.